Good evening, Windsor.
At 11:17 on a Thursday morning that began like any other, Prince William's phone rang with a tone reserved for only the most urgent palace communications. The kind of call that arrives maybe twice in a lifetime. The kind that divides time into before and after. Within seconds of answering, his face drained of color. His hands, usually so steady, began to tremble. And in that moment, standing alone in his private office at Kensington Palace, while winter lights streamed through windows that suddenly felt too bright, William received news so devastating that even the stone walls seemed to absorb the shock. The shattering moment. The call came from Sir Clive Alderton, King Charles's principal private secretary, a man known for his unshakable composure even during the monarchy's darkest hours. But today, his voice carried something William had never heard before. Not quite panic, but close. Something urgent and irreversible. "Sir," he began, the formal address feeling heavier than usual, "you need to return to Windsor immediately. There's been a development, a serious one." William didn't waste time asking questions. The tone told him everything he needed to know. Whatever had happened was beyond routine crisis management, beyond the typical turbulence that defined royal life. He ended the call, stood motionless for 3 full seconds, then moved with the kind of focused urgency that comes from years of training for moments you pray will never arrive. Catherine was in the nursery when he found her. She looked up from helping Charlotte with schoolwork, and the expression on William's face stopped her mid-sentence. She knew that look. She had seen it only once before when his grandmother died. Without a word, she stood, excused herself from the children, and followed him into the hallway. "It's bad," William said quietly, his voice barely steady. "They won't say what over the phone, but it's bad enough that they're locking down communications." Catherine's hand found his arm, squeezing gently. She didn't ask questions either. Some moments require silence, not interrogation. Within minutes, William's protection officers had been briefed. A car was already waiting in the courtyard, engine running, ready to make the 20-minute drive to Windsor in half that time. Staff moved through Kensington Palace with practiced efficiency, but even they sensed something different in the air today. The housekeeper who had served the Wales family for 15 years later told colleagues she felt a chill that had nothing to do with December weather. As William's car pulled away from Kensington Palace, traveling at speeds normally reserved for genuine emergencies, palace communications teams across London were receiving encrypted messages. Lockdown protocols activated. All non-essential media briefings postponed indefinitely. Senior household staff recalled from leave. The machinery of crisis management, dormant for months, roared back to life with terrifying speed. At Windsor Castle, the atmosphere was even more tense. Staff who had arrived for routine duties found themselves redirected, corridors cleared, private rooms sealed. Princess Anne had arrived 30 minutes earlier, her face set in the expression she wore during the most difficult moments. Queen Camilla remained inside the private apartments, and those who glimpsed her through doorways reported she looked as though she had aged a decade overnight. But the most telling sign of catastrophe came from the absence of information. No official statement, no carefully worded health update, no reassuring press release, just silence, heavy and ominous, settling over the monarchy like snow before a storm. And in that silence, one truth became unmistakable. Whatever news William was racing toward, it would change everything. The hours before. The morning had begun ordinarily enough, which somehow made what followed even more surreal, even more impossible to reconcile with the catastrophe that would arrive by midday. William had woken at 6:30, his usual time, to the sound of his alarm and the faint voices of his children already stirring in their rooms down the hall. He'd shared breakfast with Catherine and the children in the warm kitchen at Kensington Palace, discussing George's upcoming exams and Charlotte's piano recital, the mundane details of family life that provided anchor and normalcy amid the extraordinary weight of royal duty. Louis had spilled juice on the table, Charlotte had complained about her mathematics homework, and George had asked, as he did most mornings, whether he could skip his French lesson. Ordinary, beautifully, heartbreakingly ordinary. By 8:15, William was in his office reviewing the day's schedule with his private secretary. A veterans' charity meeting at 10 o'clock. Lunch with advisors to discuss the spring tour of Australia. finalize logistics, review security protocols, afternoon calls with constitutional experts regarding parliamentary procedure, and some arcane matter involving the Privy Council. Nothing unusual, nothing that suggested the day would become one he would never forget, one that would divide his life into clear before and after. His private secretary had even joked about the light workload, suggesting with a smile that they might finish early enough for William to watch George's football practice at 4. William had laughed, grateful for the prospect of normalcy, of being simply a father cheering from the sidelines rather than a prince managing impossible expectations. But around 9:30, the first unusual signal arrived, small but unmistakable to anyone who understood the careful rhythms of royal communication. A text message from Anne, brief and cryptic in a way that immediately set off alarm bells. "Have you spoken with Father this morning?" William frowned, staring at the screen. Anne rarely texted, preferring phone calls or face-to-face conversations where tone and context couldn't be misinterpreted, and the phrasing felt odd, careful, as if she were testing whether he knew something she couldn't directly say, some information she needed to confirm he either possessed or lacked. He replied that he hadn't spoken to Charles since their brief conversation the previous evening, when his father had seemed tired but otherwise fine. Anne's response was even more concerning, arriving almost immediately. "Call me when you can, privately." William tried reaching her immediately, pressing her contact with fingers that had already begun to feel cold despite the warmth of his office. The call went to voicemail. He tried again 10 minutes later, then 15 minutes after that. Same result. Her voice politely asking him to leave a message, a recording that felt increasingly inadequate as his concern deepened. That's when the unease began settling in his chest, a tightness he couldn't quite explain or dismiss, a feeling he'd learned over the years never to ignore. Anne always answered, always. Her phone was an extension of her duty, and duty for Anne was sacred and absolute, something she would never compromise without extraordinary reason. Catherine noticed the shift in his demeanor around 10 o'clock, the way his attention had turned inward, his focus narrowing to something she couldn't see but clearly felt. "Everything all right?" she asked, pausing in the doorway of his office, her voice carrying that particular note of concern she reserved for moments when she sensed something wrong beneath the surface. William looked up from his phone, where he'd been staring at Anne's unanswered calls, the screen now dark but still demanding his attention. "Probably," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise, betrayed the lie even as he spoke it. "Just can't reach Anne. It's strange." Catherine knew better than to dismiss his instincts. After years together, after watching him navigate countless crises and complications, she had learned that William's sense of when something was wrong rarely failed him. By 10:30, more pieces of the puzzle emerged, though none of them made sense yet. None of them formed a coherent picture he could understand. William's equerry mentioned in passing that the king's morning schedule had been suddenly cleared, all appointments cancelled without explanation, or the usual diplomatic restructuring that accompanied routine changes. The official line was routine adjustment, but staff who had been preparing for a scheduled investiture ceremony, laying out medals and printing programs, found themselves dismissed with barely an hour's notice. Then came word that Camilla had cancelled her public engagement at a London hospital, citing a personal matter. That detail hit harder than the others. Camilla never cancelled, never. She prided herself on reliability, on showing up regardless of circumstance, on maintaining the steady presence the public expected. William tried calling his father directly, dialing the private number that bypassed all normal palace protocols. The line rang 3 times before connecting, but instead of Charles's voice, he heard the apologetic tone of his father's private secretary, who explained that His Majesty was in meetings and would return the call shortly. But something in the secretary's voice felt rehearsed, scripted, as if he were following instructions to deflect rather than inform, to maintain a fiction that was already crumbling. William ended the call, feeling more unsettled than before, his unease now solidifying into something closer to dread. At 11 o'clock, William was supposed to be at his veterans meeting, shaking hands and hearing stories from men and women who had served. Instead, he sat at his desk, staring at his phone, waiting for clarity that refused to come, for someone to call and explain that everything was fine, that he'd been worrying over nothing. Catherine brought him tea, setting it down gently beside the papers he'd stopped reading 20 minutes earlier. "William," she said softly, her hand resting briefly on his shoulder, Whatever it is, we'll handle it." He nodded, but the reassurance felt hollow, inadequate. Some things couldn't simply be handled. Some things could only be endured. Then, at 11:17, his phone rang with that distinctive tone, the one reserved for only the most urgent palace communications, the one that meant someone at the highest level of palace operations needed to reach him immediately, the one that bypassed all normal protocols and announced, before a single word was spoken, that something had gone catastrophically wrong. William picked up on the first ring, and Sir Clive Alderton's voice, strained and urgent in ways William had never heard before, delivered words that would replay in William's mind for years to come, words that would mark the exact moment his life changed forever. The truth emerges. The drive to Windsor felt endless despite the speed, despite the fact that William's protection officer was pushing well beyond normal limits, treating empty motorway lanes as if they existed solely for this emergency. William sat in the back seat, silent, rigid, staring through tinted windows at countryside that blurred past in streaks of winter brown and gray. His protection officer, a man named Thomas, who had served him for 8 years and seen him through countless difficult moments, from family crises to security threats, knew better than to attempt conversation. Some silences demand respect, and this one felt almost sacred in its heaviness. When the car finally pulled through Windsor's gates, William noticed immediately how different everything felt, how the familiar landscape of the castle grounds had transformed into something foreign and ominous. Staff stood in unusual positions, clustered in doorways rather than moving through their normal routines. Security had been doubled, perhaps tripled, with additional officers stationed at every entrance. And the main entrance, typically bustling with the routine activity of a working palace, was sealed except for essential personnel, cordoned off as if preparing for siege rather than governance. He was directed not to the main reception rooms where official business normally occurred, but to a private wing, one used only for the most sensitive family matters, for conversations that couldn't risk even the slightest chance of being overheard. Anne was waiting in the corridor outside the king's private study, standing perfectly still in a way that somehow communicated more tension than any pacing could have. She stood with her arms crossed, her face grave but composed in that way she had mastered over decades of navigating royal crisis, of being the steady hand when everyone else faltered. When she saw William approaching, something in her expression shifted subtly, not quite sympathy but acknowledgement. She knew what he was about to learn, and she knew it would hurt in ways that would reshape him. "How bad?" William asked, his voice low, almost afraid of the answer but needing it nonetheless. Anne didn't soften it. She never did. "Worse than we thought possible." Inside the study, Charles sat in a high-backed chair near the fireplace, though no fire burned despite the December chill that had settled into the room's corners. The room felt cold, sterile, wrong in ways William couldn't immediately articulate. Camilla stood behind him, one hand resting on his shoulder in a gesture that seemed both protective and desperately clinging, her eyes red-rimmed but dry, as if she'd already exhausted her capacity for tears. And on the desk, carefully arranged as if presentation could somehow lessen impact, were medical reports with official letterheads, legal documents bearing government seals, and a single handwritten letter in Charles's distinctive script, the fountain pen he favored visible beside it. Sir Clive Alderton, along with the King's senior physician and 2 constitutional advisors, William recognized from previous sensitive meetings, stood near the windows, their faces carrying the weight of men who had delivered unbearable news and were now waiting to deliver it again, to watch another person absorb what they had already processed. William entered slowly, his feet feeling heavy against the carpet, every instinct screaming that whatever came next would be worse than anything his imagination had conjured during the interminable drive. Charles looked up, and William saw immediately what he'd been trying desperately not to see during the journey. His father looked diminished, smaller somehow, as though the news he carried had physically shrunk him, hollowed him out from the inside. "William," Charles said, his voice rougher than usual, scratched and worn, "sit down, please." William remained standing, his body refusing the comfort of sitting, as if remaining upright could somehow maintain control over a situation that was clearly spiraling beyond anyone's control. "Just tell me," he said, the words coming out more forcefully than he'd intended. The king's physician stepped forward, holding a file that seemed too thin to contain something catastrophic, too ordinary to hold the weight William could already feel pressing against his chest. But catastrophes, William was learning in real time, often arrive in deceptively small packages, in manila folders and quiet rooms rather than dramatic announcements. The physician spoke in clinical terms first, the language of medicine providing temporary shelter from emotional devastation, a buffer between reality and feeling. Advanced progression, unexpected complications, treatment options exhausted, timeline dramatically shortened, words that danced around the truth while simultaneously containing nothing but truth. William heard the words, processed their technical meaning through the fog that was settling over his mind, but his mind refused to accept the conclusion they led toward, the inevitable endpoint that loomed like a cliff edge. "How long?" he asked, cutting through the medical terminology, demanding the one piece of information that mattered, the one fact that would define everything that followed. The physician exchanged glances with Sir Clive, a silent communication that William recognized as the moment before unbearable news. Weeks, perhaps months if we're fortunate, but not years. Not anymore. The room seemed to tilt, the floor shifting beneath William's feet as if the earth itself was rejecting this information. William gripped the edge of a nearby chair, steadying himself against news that felt physically crushing, that seemed to carry actual weight pressing down on his shoulders, his chest, his entire body. His father, the king who had waited a lifetime to wear the crown, who had only just begun the reign he'd spent decades preparing for, who had finally achieved the role he'd been born to fulfill, was dying. Not in some distant, theoretical future that could be pushed aside and ignored. Soon, irreversibly, devastatingly soon. Charles spoke then, his voice carrying a strange calm that William recognized as the composure of someone who had already processed shock and moved into acceptance, who had lived with this knowledge long enough to find some measure of peace with it. "I've known for 3 days," he said quietly, each word carefully measured. "I needed time to understand it myself before telling anyone else. I'm sorry you had to wait for the truth." William wanted to be angry about the delay, wanted to rage against the unfairness of timing and circumstance, against the cruelty of being kept in the dark while his father carried this alone. But looking at his father now, seeing the exhaustion and resignation in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly where they rested on the chair arms, anger felt impossible, inappropriate, beside the point. "Does anyone else know?" he managed to ask, his voice sounding distant and strange in his own ears. "Anne, Camilla, the medical team, constitutional advisors who needed to begin preparations." Charles paused, choosing his next words carefully, his gaze never leaving William's face. "And now you, because what comes next will fall to you far sooner than any of us imagined." A family in crisis. The hours following that initial devastating conversation moved with a strange, disjointed quality, as if time itself had become unreliable, stretching some moments into unbearable length while compressing others into meaningless blur. William remained at Windsor, unable to process what leaving would mean, what returning to normalcy would require when normal no longer existed, when the entire framework of his life had been fundamentally altered in the space of a single conversation. Catherine arrived by early afternoon, having arranged for the children to stay with trusted staff at Kensington Palace, protected for now from the knowledge that would soon reshape their world as well. She found William in one of the smaller sitting rooms, staring at nothing, looking lost in ways she'd never seen before, not even during the darkest moments after his grandmother's death. She sat beside him without speaking, her presence offering the only comfort possible in a moment when comfort felt inadequate, when words seemed to fall short of the enormity of what they were facing. After several minutes of silence that felt both endless and too brief, William finally spoke. "I'm not ready." 3 words, barely whispered, but carrying the weight of everything he'd been holding back since leaving his father's study. "I'm not ready to be king. Not like this, not now, not when it means losing him." Catherine took his hand, squeezing gently, her thumb tracing circles across his knuckles in a gesture she'd repeated countless times over the years they'd been together. "No one is ever ready for this," she said, her voice steady, anchoring the calm he desperately needed in the chaos swirling through his mind. "But you will do it anyway because that's what you were born to do, because you're his son and because you have no choice." Her voice softened. "And you won't do it alone. Not for a single moment." Throughout the afternoon, the palace transformed into a command center managing a crisis that couldn't yet be made public, that required absolute secrecy even as dozens of people scrambled to prepare for what was coming. Constitutional experts gathered in secure rooms, reviewing protocols for succession that hadn't been implemented since 1952, examining regency options and studying the complex legal mechanisms that governed the transfer of power from one monarch to another. Some of these procedures hadn't been seriously examined in decades, their language antiquated, their assumptions rooted in a world that no longer existed. Dust was being blown off documents that most had hoped would remain theoretical for decades longer, plans that should have stayed safely hypothetical until William was older, more experienced, more prepared. Princess Anne moved through Windsor with her characteristic efficiency, making decisions that others were too paralyzed to make, too overwhelmed by emotion to approach with clear thinking. She coordinated with the Prime Minister's office through secure channels, ensuring government was prepared for what was coming, that the machinery of state wouldn't falter during the transition. She reviewed security protocols with military advisors, understanding instinctively that threats always multiplied during periods of vulnerability, that enemies both foreign and domestic would see opportunity in royal tragedy. And she handled the delicate task of beginning to inform extended family members, making calls to relatives across Britain and Europe, delivering news that would ripple through the entire royal structure, like shockwaves from an earthquake's epicenter. Camilla, meanwhile, remained closest to Charles, her world narrowing to the man whose time was being measured now not in years or even months, but in diminishing increments of weeks and days. Staff reported that she barely left his side, eating meals with him even when he couldn't eat, forcing herself to maintain normalcy even as everything crumbled. She sat in rooms reading even when he slept, maintaining presence as if proximity could somehow slow what was inevitable, as if love alone could hold back mortality. She had fought so hard to stand beside him as queen, had weathered decades of criticism, scandal, and public hatred to reach this position, and now that position was being torn away before she'd barely begun to inhabit it, before they'd had any real time together in the roles they'd waited so long to fill. The most painful aspect, the one that threatened to break William entirely, was the children. He and Catherine faced the impossible task of deciding when and how to tell George, Charlotte, and Louis that their grandfather, whom they adored, who told them stories and played games and made them laugh, was dying. George, at 11, would understand the permanence, would grasp that death meant forever, would carry this loss into his own future as king. Charlotte would grasp enough to be devastated, her sensitive nature making her particularly vulnerable to grief. Louis might be too young to fully comprehend, which carried its own heartbreak, the knowledge that he would lose these precious years with his grandfather without fully understanding what was being taken from him. They decided to wait, giving themselves time to find words adequate for explaining the inexplicable, for making sense of something that defied sense. By evening, exhaustion had settled over everyone involved, a bone-deep weariness that went beyond mere physical tiredness. William stood at a window overlooking the grounds, watching darkness swallow the landscape, the winter night arriving early and absolute. Anne found him there, standing in silence for a long moment before speaking, respecting the quiet before breaking it. "You're thinking about all the things you'll never get to ask him," she said. Not a question, a statement of understanding born from her own experience with loss. William nodded, not trusting his voice initially. When he finally spoke, the words came thick with emotion. "There's so much I still needed to learn, about being king, about managing this life, about carrying this burden without losing yourself." He turned to face her, and in his eyes she saw not the future king, but the frightened son. "He waited so long for this. It's not fair. None of this is fair." Anne's response was characteristically direct, honest in ways that others might have considered cruel, but that William needed to hear. "Fairness has nothing to do with monarchy. It never has." But then her voice softened slightly, revealing the emotion she usually kept carefully hidden. "But you're right. He deserved more time. We all did. And I'm sorry you're being asked to face this now." The impossible decision. The following morning brought new crises layered atop existing devastation. William was summoned to an emergency meeting in the secure conference room where constitutional advisors, legal experts, and senior palace officials had been working through the night. The exhaustion showed on their faces, but their purpose was urgent and unavoidable. Decisions had to be made, and they had to be made now. Sir Clive Alderton opened the discussion with characteristic directness. Your Royal Highness, we need to address several immediate questions regarding succession procedures and public announcement protocols. The situation requires decisions that only you and His Majesty can authorize. William sat at the head of the table, a position that felt simultaneously premature and inevitable. What are the options? His voice was steady, though his hands remained clasped tightly beneath the table, hidden from view. The Constitutional Secretary, a woman who had served the Crown for 40 years, spoke next. The first question is timing. When do we inform the public about His Majesty's prognosis? She slid a document across the table. We have 3 primary scenarios outlined, each with different implications. Option 1. Immediate public announcement. Full transparency, acknowledging the King's terminal diagnosis and limited time frame. The advantage was honesty, preventing the corrosive effect of rumors and speculation. The disadvantage was panic. Markets would react. International relations would destabilize. The nation, barely adjusted to Charles's reign, would face immediate preparation for another transition. Option 2. Gradual disclosure. Begin with general health concerns. Allow the public to adjust, then provide updates as the situation progressed. This approach offered time for collective processing but risked accusations of deception when the full truth eventually emerged. And the truth always emerged. Option 3. Minimal disclosure until absolutely necessary. Maintain privacy, adjust schedules quietly, and only announce the severity when death was imminent. This protected the King's dignity and the family's grief, but violated the public trust at a moment when trust was essential. William stared at the options, each one representing a different kind of failure. "What does my father want?" he asked quietly. Anne, who had been present throughout the night's deliberations, answered, "He wants to protect you from having to make this choice. But that's impossible now. The choice exists, and someone must make it." The military secretary added another complication. "There are also security considerations, Your Royal Highness. Once the severity becomes public knowledge, threat levels increase. We'll need to enhance protection for all senior royals, particularly yourself and your family. Succession always attracts instability." William felt the weight pressing down, the responsibility that had always been abstract becoming crushingly concrete. He thought about his children, about the life they'd known being shattered. He thought about Catherine, who would become queen consort years before they'd planned. He thought about his father, robbed of the reign he'd waited for. And he thought about himself, about to inherit a throne in the worst possible circumstances. "I need to speak with my father," William said finally. "Before any decisions are made, I need to hear directly from him what he wants. Not what's constitutional, not what's traditional, but what he wants." The meeting paused while William was escorted to Charles's private rooms. He found his father sitting in his study, papers spread before him, still trying to work even as his body failed him. It was so perfectly, heartbreakingly characteristic that William had to pause in the doorway, steadying himself. Charles looked up and managed a weak smile. "They've presented you with impossible choices, haven't they?" He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit. Let's talk as father and son, not as king and heir." What followed was a conversation William would carry with him forever. Charles spoke about his fears, his regrets, the things he wished he'd accomplished and now never would. But more importantly, he spoke about William, about his confidence in his son's readiness, his pride in the man William had become, his certainty that the crown would be safe in his hands. "I want you to announce it," Charles said finally. "Not immediately, but soon, within the week. The public deserves truth, and I deserve to spend my remaining time without the burden of pretending." His voice grew firmer. "And you deserve time to prepare, to transition, to step into this role with dignity rather than chaos." William's throat tightened. "I don't know if I can do this." Charles reached across the desk, taking his son's hand. "You can, you will, because you're my son, and you were born for this moment, even though neither of us wanted it to come so soon." When William returned to the conference room, his decision was made. They would announce within 3 days, allowing time to prepare the family, coordinate with the government, and draft a statement that balanced honesty with dignity. The impossible choice had been made, and now they would face its consequences together. Aftermath and uncertainty. The announcement came on a gray Monday morning, 3 days after William received the devastating news. At 8 o'clock precisely, Buckingham Palace released a statement that would dominate headlines across the world for weeks to come. His Majesty. The King has been informed by his medical team that his condition has progressed more rapidly than anticipated. Treatment options have been exhausted. The King and his family are grateful for the support of the public during this difficult time. The words were carefully chosen, clinical yet clear. No false hope, no dramatic language, just the truth, delivered with the dignity the moment required. But the impact was anything but clinical. Within minutes, the world stopped. Trading floors fell silent. Television programs were interrupted. Social media exploded with grief, shock, and an outpouring of support that crossed national boundaries and political divides. In Britain, the reaction was particularly intense among older viewers who had watched Charles wait his entire life to be king. There was something uniquely cruel about his reign being cut short so dramatically, so quickly. Vigils began forming outside Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle by mid-morning, people gathering not to protest or demand, but simply to stand together in shared grief. American networks devoted entire days to coverage, with experts analyzing everything from constitutional implications to the emotional toll on the family. CBS ran a special segment on William's sudden burden, interviewing psychologists about the trauma of preparing to lose a parent while simultaneously preparing to inherit unimaginable responsibility. CNN brought in historians to discuss previous short reigns and sudden successions, searching for precedents that might offer comfort or context. Inside Kensington Palace, William and Catherine faced their own private aftermath. They told the children that same Monday evening, gathering them in the sitting room and explaining as gently as possible that Grandpa was very sick and wouldn't get better. George understood immediately, his face crumpling before he turned away to hide tears. Charlotte cried openly, asking questions that had no good answers. Louis, confused but sensing the grief around him, simply climbed into Catherine's lap and stayed there. At Windsor, Charles experienced the strange phenomenon of living through his own eulogy. Tributes poured in from world leaders, celebrities, and ordinary citizens. Television programs began running retrospectives of his life, his advocacy for environmental causes, and his decades of public service. He watched some of it with Camilla, finding the experience surreal and unexpectedly moving. Princess Anne threw herself into logistics because logistics were controllable when emotions were not. She coordinated with funeral directors, reviewed ceremonial protocols, and ensured every detail of what would come next was planned and prepared. When colleagues suggested she slow down, rest, she responded with characteristic bluntness. There will be time for grief after. Right now, there is work. The most profound change settled over William himself. In the weeks following the announcement, he transformed before the eyes of those closest to him. The weight he carried became visible in his posture, his expressions, the way he moved through rooms as though the air itself had grown heavier. He took meetings with constitutional advisors, reviewed documents about succession, and studied protocols he'd been avoiding thinking about for years. The abstract future had become immediate present. But amid the preparation and grief, there were also moments of grace. Charles, freed from the burden of secrecy, spent his remaining strength with family. Long conversations with William about kingship and fatherhood, quiet afternoons with Camilla, reading together in silence, video calls with George, Charlotte, and Louis, where he told them stories and made them laugh even as he grew visibly weaker. As December deepened toward Christmas, the monarchy existed in a state of suspended time. Everyone knew what was coming, but the knowledge didn't make it easier. William found himself waking in the middle of the night, thinking about all the things he still wanted to ask his father, all the guidance he still needed, all the time they wouldn't have. Catherine found him one such night, standing at a window watching snow fall over Kensington Gardens. She didn't say anything, just stood beside him, her hand finding his. Sometimes there were no words adequate for the moment. Sometimes presence was all that could be offered. And in that silence, as snow continued to fall and the city slept, William understood that this was what kingship truly meant. Not the ceremonies or the crown or the constitutional authority, but this, standing in the darkness, carrying impossible weight, knowing that tomorrow would demand everything from you, and choosing to face it anyway because duty, family, and love required nothing less. The crown does not wait for readiness. It does not pause for grief or adjust for circumstance. It simply passes, as it has for centuries, from one generation to the next. And William, son and heir, stands now at the threshold between what was and what must be, carrying his father's legacy forward into a future neither of them wanted, but both must face. From which country are you watching this unfold? Your perspective adds meaning to how this story resonates across the world. Thank you for bearing witness to this moment with me.